Something is finally cracking after weeks of relentless pressure building across the atmosphere. For weeks now, a stubborn ridge of high pressure has been sitting anchored over huge stretches of the country, locking in the kind of relentless, sweat-through-your-shirt summer heat that makes every single day feel like a repeat of the one before it. And right now, in the middle of August, that ridge is breaking apart, not quietly, not gradually, but in a genuine multi-region reshuffling that meteorologists across the country are independently flagging as the first real pattern change several parts of the United States have seen in over a month. This isn't one city getting a lucky cold front. This is Montana watching wildfire smoke finally clear out as a cold front sweeps through. This is Colorado's Front Range, after weeks of haze and bone-dry afternoons, suddenly staring down a real shot at heavy monsoon rainfall as a hot ridge weakens and slides southeast. This is parts of the East Coast bracing for what one meteorologist is already calling the longest August cooldown since 2017, an entire stretch of days staying below 90 degrees for the first time in years at this point in the calendar. And this is Texas, arguably ground zero for this summer's most punishing heat, watching the same stubborn ridge that's been baking the state for weeks finally show real, genuine signs of shifting westward. Today, we're going to break down exactly what's driving this simultaneous pattern break across so many different regions at once, why meteorologists rely on something called ensemble forecasting to catch these shifts coming before they actually arrive, what each part of the country can genuinely expect as this transition plays out, and why a shift like this matters so much more than any single day's forecast headline lets on. If breaking down what's actually happening behind the daily forecast is something you find useful, go ahead and subscribe, because this transition is going to keep evolving through the rest of the month, and there's a lot more to track as it unfolds. Drop a comment and let me know if you've already started noticing a change where you live, because I have a feeling a lot of you are about to feel this shift firsthand within the next few days if you haven't already. And if this kind of breakdown helps make sense of what's going on, a quick, genuinely helps more people find it. Let's start by understanding exactly what a ridge of high pressure actually is and why it's been so stubbornly difficult to dislodge this particular summer, before we get into how forecasters actually caught this shift coming. A ridge, in the simplest possible terms, is a bulge of high pressure sitting in the upper atmosphere that causes air underneath it to sink. As that air sinks, it compresses, and compression causes it to warm even further on top of whatever heat is already building at the surface from direct sunlight. Because high pressure systems also actively suppress cloud formation, a strong ridge tends to produce clear, cloudless skies day after day, which means there's essentially nothing standing between the sun and the ground for hour after hour, allowing temperatures to climb higher and higher the longer the ridge stays parked in place. Under normal atmospheric conditions, ridges like this build, peak over the course of several days, and then get pushed along by the broader jet stream, allowing cooler air and more typical variability to move back in behind them. What made this particular ridge so exceptional wasn't its peak strength alone, it was its sheer persistence, refusing to budge for weeks on end across huge sections of the country, from the Gulf Coast, up through the plains, and into Texas specifically, where forecasters had been openly discussing the hottest stretch of the entire summer still lying ahead, even as August moved deeper into its second week. Here's where the story actually gets interesting, because the way meteorologists caught this pattern break coming isn't through a single dramatic forecast update. It's through a tool called ensemble forecasting, and understanding how it works genuinely changes how you should think about any long-range weather outlook you come across. When meteorologists look more than about a week ahead, they don't rely on one single model run producing one single definitive answer, because the atmosphere is simply too chaotic a system for that kind of precision to hold up reliably that far in advance. Instead, they run the same core weather model dozens of times, each run starting from very slightly different initial conditions, small variations representing the unavoidable uncertainty in exactly how precisely we can measure the atmosphere's current state everywhere on the planet at once. Each of those dozens of runs produces its own slightly different projected outcome. And when meteorologists look at the full spread of those outcomes together, called an ensemble, they can identify the most likely overall pattern even when they can't pin down the exact specifics of any single day with total confidence. This is exactly the process that caught this week's shift coming days in advance, well before any single daily forecast would have flagged it on its own. In Texas specifically, the ECMWF model, often called the European model and generally regarded as one of the most reliable tools available for exactly this kind of medium-range forecasting, had been showing a persistent, dangerous stretch of 104 to 105 degree heat extending well into August. Then, gradually, across successive runs, that ensemble average began backing away from those extreme numbers, shifting closer to a still hot but meaningfully less brutal 99 to 101 degree range, The GFS model, the primary American forecasting system, began showing a similar trend independently. When two separate major forecasting systems, built and run by entirely different national agencies using different underlying code, both start converging on the same shift away from an established pattern, that agreement is exactly the kind of signal meteorologists treat as a genuine, credible sign that a real pattern change is actually on the way, rather than just short-term noise in a single forecast run. Let's walk through what this shift actually looks like region by region, because the character of this pattern break is genuinely different depending on where you're standing, even though the underlying cause, that same stubborn ridge finally losing its grip, is shared across nearly all of them. In Montana, the immediate story has been less about temperature and more about air quality, with widespread haze and areas of near-surface smoke keeping conditions unhealthy for sensitive groups across the western and southwestern parts of the state, an air quality alert stretching across the Helena area and beyond. The fix arriving isn't subtle. A cold front pushing south through the region is bringing much cleaner air in its wake, with visibility and air quality both expected to improve significantly within a day of the front's passage and remain improved through the rest of the week. A direct, tangible example of how a pattern break doesn't just change the thermometer reading, it can fundamentally change the quality of the air people are actually breathing. In Colorado, the transition carries a genuinely different character, tied closely to the summer monsoon rather than a simple cooldown. After weeks of stubborn heat and dry afternoons across the Front Range, the hot ridge responsible for that stretch is weakening and sliding southeast toward Texas. And as it moves out of the way, broader troughing is expanding into the Great Basin behind it. That realignment opens the door for genuine monsoonal flow to return to Colorado, bringing deeper moisture, better atmospheric instability, and the kind of embedded disturbances that enhance lift and fuel widespread thunderstorm development. Storm coverage is expected to increase sharply through the middle of the week, peaking as a shallow cold front approaches, with forecasters citing storm chances running as high as 50 to 80%, and daytime highs dropping from the 90s down into the upper 70s and low 80s, a genuinely dramatic swing for a region that had been stuck under haze, heat, and bone-dry conditions for weeks beforehand. Precipitable water values, essentially a measure of how much total moisture is available in the atmospheric column above a given location, are expected to surge well above what's typical for this point in the calendar, as that renewed monsoon moisture streams back into the region, setting up the potential for genuinely heavy rainfall in spots that had been parched for weeks. Down in Texas, the shift is more modest in absolute terms, but still meaningful given just how extreme the preceding stretch had been. Central Texas is still expected to spend much of the coming week in the triple digits, and nobody should mistake what's coming for any kind of early taste of fall. But the longer-range forecast guidance increasingly suggests that stubborn ridge responsible for weeks of extreme heat may finally shift westward as the month progresses, opening the door for at least a weak summer cold front, or at minimum, a meaningful reduction in the most extreme end of the heat, even if humidity stays elevated and the air remains hot by any normal standard. That combination of triple-digit afternoons and warm overnight lows had been steadily compounding heat stress across the region, particularly for anyone spending extended time outdoors, which is exactly why even a modest crack in that pattern, dropping peak highs by 3 to 5 degrees, represents genuinely welcome relief for a region that's been enduring the worst of this summer's heat for weeks on end. Along the Gulf Coast, a similar story has already begun playing out over the past couple of weeks, offering a useful preview of what a fuller pattern break can look like once it fully arrives. After weeks of typical punishing summertime heat and humidity, in early August, cold front pushed south into the region, delivering scattered thunderstorms before allowing drier air to filter in behind it. While that shift didn't bring anything resembling fall-like temperatures, plenty of residents noticed the meaningfully lower humidity and the reduced frequency of afternoon pop-up storms in the days that followed. A small but genuinely noticeable improvement in daily comfort, even without a dramatic drop in the thermometer reading itself. Further inland, similar weak cold fronts have delivered comparable brief dips in humidity, temporary relief that forecasters have consistently cautioned tends to be short-lived, given how quickly humidity has been building back in behind each successive front this particular summer, a pattern that speaks directly to just how entrenched this overall ridge has been before finally beginning to crack more broadly this week. And then there's the stretch of the East Coast and the broader eastern United States, where this pattern break has the potential to produce the most dramatic, sustained change of all. Forecasters in parts of the region are already discussing the possibility of the longest August cooldown since 2017, an extended run of days with highs staying below 90 degrees that, if it holds through the end of the month, would represent one of the most comfortable late summer stretches in years. A cold front moving through is expected to drop daytime highs from the 90s down into the 80s for much of the coming week, a refreshing break after a run of days spent in the 90s, with overnight lows also becoming noticeably more pleasant, dipping into the 60s across many areas, conditions that meteorologists describe as considerably better suited for early morning jogs, evening outdoor sports, and generally giving air conditioning systems across the region a genuine break after weeks of near-constant demand. Elsewhere across the interior, northeast, and mid-Atlantic, a comparable pattern has been unfolding as a strong cold front pushes through, ushering in a period of below normal temperatures behind it, with the coolest mornings of the stretch typically arriving once high pressure fully settles in behind the front and allows skies to clear overnight, letting temperatures drop even further than they would under a lingering cloud deck. It's worth spending a moment on what a stretch of triple-digit heat compounded by warm overnight lows actually does to the human body over time, because that mechanism explains why this pattern break matters for public health, not just for personal comfort. The body's primary defense against dangerous overheating during the day is the ability to cool back down overnight, allowing core temperature to reset before the next day's heat begins building again. When overnight lows stay elevated, remaining in the upper 70s or low 80s rather than dropping into a more typical range, that recovery window shrinks considerably, and heat stress can begin accumulating across consecutive days rather than resetting each morning the way it would under more typical summer conditions. This is exactly why a pattern break that finally allows overnight lows to drop into the 60s again, as forecasters are describing for parts of the East Coast this week, represents more than just a pleasant change in how the evening feels. It represents a genuine physiological reset for anyone who's been enduring weeks of compounding heat stress, particularly older residents, people with underlying health conditions, and anyone whose daily routine keeps them outdoors during the hottest parts of the day. Public health officials and local emergency management agencies in regions that have been under sustained heat advisories tend to watch for exactly this kind of pattern break as a meaningful marker, since it typically corresponds with measurable drops in heat-related emergency room visits in the days that follow a genuine, sustained cool-down, as opposed to the temporary single-day relief a brief passing shower might offer without any lasting shift in the broader pattern behind it. There's also a real economic dimension tied to this transition that extends well beyond personal comfort, particularly across the agricultural regions caught under the most extreme and prolonged stretch of this summer's heat. Sustained periods of extreme heat during critical growing windows can meaningfully stress crops even without tipping into full drought conditions, reducing yields for staples that entire regional economies depend on. And livestock operations face an even more immediate risk, since cattle and other animals without adequate shade or cooling access can suffer serious heat stress within hours once temperature and humidity cross certain thresholds. A pattern break that finally allows daytime highs to ease back from the absolute extremes, even without a dramatic full cooldown, genuinely matters to farmers and ranchers across the affected regions, buying crops and livestock a meaningful reprieve during a period that can otherwise compound losses day after day, the longer an extreme heat pattern holds in place without any real break. On the energy side, weeks of sustained, near-constant air conditioning demand place real strain on regional power grids, and utilities operating across the hardest-hit areas have had to plan around exactly this kind of extended, multi-week demand surge rather than the brief, single-day spike a normal summer heat wave might produce. A pattern break that finally allows that demand to ease, even modestly, offers grid operators a genuine opportunity to catch up on maintenance and rebuild operating margins that had been stretched thin through weeks of sustained peak demand. It's worth pausing here to address an important nuance because not every consequence of this pattern break is purely positive, and being upfront about that trade-off is part of giving an honest, complete picture of what's actually unfolding. In some areas, transitioning into this drier, high-pressure-dominated pattern behind the initial cold front passage, meteorologists are already flagging a secondary concern building underneath the more immediately pleasant, cooler temperatures. As that drier air settles in and skies clear more consistently, some regions are expected to see abnormally dry conditions begin to expand. And in spots that were already running on the drier side, heading into this transition, that dryness has the potential to develop into moderate drought conditions if the pattern holds for an extended stretch without any meaningful rainfall returning to interrupt it. This is a genuinely important reminder that a pattern break isn't simply a binary swap from bad weather to good weather. It's a fundamental reshuffling of which specific weather risks a given region is dealing with, heat and humidity trading places, with a drier, more drought-prone setup in some areas, even as it trades places with a much-needed return of monsoon moisture in others like Colorado. It's also worth explaining the actual mechanism behind why a cold front sweeping through can clear out smoke and haze as effectively as it did in Montana, because the connection between temperature and air quality isn't always intuitive at first glance. Under a stubborn ridge of high pressure, sinking air doesn't just warm the surface, it also traps whatever pollutants and smoke happen to be present underneath a stable layer of atmosphere, preventing that smoke from mixing upward and dispersing the way it normally would under more active, unstable conditions. Wildfire smoke drifting in from fires burning elsewhere in the region or across the broader west effectively gets trapped in place by the same high-pressure system responsible for the extended heat, settling into valleys and low-lying areas and simply accumulating day after day rather than clearing out. When a cold front finally arrives and breaks that ridge down, it doesn't just bring cooler temperatures, it brings an entirely different air mass with it, one typically originating from a region with less smoke to begin with, and the increased wind and instability associated with the front's passage actively helps mix and disperse whatever haze had built up beforehand. That's exactly the mechanism behind the rapid improvement forecasters described for western Montana, where an air quality alert that had been in place for days was expected to lift within roughly a day of the front's arrival. A genuinely fast turnaround that illustrates just how directly tied together temperature, pressure, and air quality actually are within the same broader atmospheric system. It's also worth putting this particular ridge breakdown in some historical context, because meteorologists don't casually reach for comparisons like the longest August cooldown since 2017 without those kinds of historical benchmarks actually meaning something. A stretch of that length, an entire month with highs consistently staying below 90 degrees, represents a genuinely unusual outcome for late summer across the affected region, one that past years have only occasionally managed to produce. The comparison matters because it helps frame just how stubborn and unusual this particular summer's heat pattern has actually been leading up to this break. A typical August cooldown might last a handful of days before the underlying summer pattern reasserts itself and heat rebuilds. A cooldown genuinely capable of holding for multiple consecutive weeks, which is what some forecasters are now flagging as a real possibility, it would represent a meaningfully different kind of pattern shift than the more common, temporary crack that shows up for a few days before the old heat comes right back. Whether this particular transition actually ends up matching that historical benchmark, or instead settles into a more typical brief interruption before heat rebuilds, remains one of the genuinely open questions hanging over this entire forecast. And it's exactly the kind of detail that becomes clearer only as each subsequent week of shorter range forecasts actually arrives and confirms, or challenges, what the longer range ensemble data is currently suggesting. Let's talk about why this kind of widespread multi-region pattern break tends to happen when it does. Because it isn't purely a random coincidence that so many different parts of the country are seeing some version of this shift within the same general window of days. When a ridge of high pressure has been anchored in place for an unusually long stretch, as this one has been for weeks now, it tends to build up increasingly strong contrast with the cooler, more active weather patterns that get pushed to its periphery, essentially getting walled off in Canada or displaced well to the north and west of where the ridge itself sits. That growing contrast doesn't stay stable indefinitely. Eventually, the broader jet stream pattern reorganizes in a way that allows the ridge to finally break down, either shifting position, weakening in strength, or getting replaced entirely by a trough. And when that reorganization happens, it tends to happen across a fairly broad geographic area all at once, rather than in one isolated location, precisely because the underlying jet stream itself operates as a connected continent-spanning system, rather than a series of disconnected local phenomena. That's exactly why you're seeing versions of this same basic story, a stubborn ridge finally cracking, playing out simultaneously in Montana, Colorado, Texas, the Gulf Coast, and the East Coast within roughly the same window of days, even though the specific character of what replaces the ridge, cleaner air, monsoon storms, a modest cool down, or a genuinely dramatic extended cool stretch, looks meaningfully different from one region to the next. It's worth mentioning, too, just how much easier a pattern break like this one becomes to communicate with genuine confidence once independent forecasting agencies across different regions all start describing the same underlying shift, using strikingly similar language, even though each one is focused on their own specific local impacts. Meteorologists in Montana describing cleaner air arriving behind a cold front, meteorologists in Colorado describing a weakening ridge sliding southeast, meteorologists in Texas describing ensemble models backing away from the most extreme heat numbers, and meteorologists across the East Coast describing the potential for a record-length cooldown, are all, in effect, describing different regional faces of the exact same continent-spanning atmospheric reorganization, without necessarily framing it that way for their own local audiences. That kind of independent convergence across multiple unrelated forecasting teams looking at their own specific regions is itself a meaningful confirmation signal, similar in spirit to the ensemble model agreement discussed earlier, just observed at the level of human forecasters rather than computer model runs. And it's part of why this particular pattern break has drawn this much attention across so many different local weather outlets simultaneously, rather than remaining a single isolated regional story. There's also a seasonal timing element worth understanding here, because mid-August sits at a genuinely important transitional point in the broader annual weather cycle, even in years without any particularly unusual pattern behavior layered on top of it. As the calendar moves past the peak of summer and towards the final weeks before the traditional start of meteorological fall, the sun angle continues to lower and the length of daylight continues to shorten, gradually reducing the total amount of solar energy available to sustain and reinforce a stubborn summer ridge in the way it could earlier in the season. That doesn't mean summer heat simply ends on a specific calendar date. Plenty of genuinely hot weather still lies ahead for large parts of the country, even after this particular pattern break plays out. But it does mean that mid to late August is exactly the point in the year when these kinds of ridge breakdowns become both more likely to occur and, once they do occur, somewhat more likely to actually stick rather than simply rebuilding back into the same stubborn pattern within a matter of days, the way a similar break attempted earlier in the summer might have. It's also worth connecting this shift back to the tropical side of the forecast, because August marks the beginning of the most active stretch of the Atlantic hurricane season, and the same broader pattern reorganization responsible for this week's cooldowns and monsoon returns can have real implications for how and where tropical systems are able to develop and track in the weeks ahead. While the Atlantic basin has remained relatively quiet through the early part of the month, with no tropical development currently expected to impact the Gulf Coast in the immediate term, forecasters have been careful to note that quiet stretches this early in the season's most active window shouldn't be mistaken for the season itself being finished, especially given how much of the traditional peak of hurricane season still lies ahead on the calendar. As the broader jet stream pattern reorganizes behind this week's ridge breakdown, the steering currents that ultimately determine whether any future tropical system tracks harmlessly out to sea or turns toward a populated coastline will themselves be reshaped by exactly the kind of large-scale pattern shift currently playing out, which is part of why meteorologists tend to watch these broader pattern transitions so closely even when no specific storm is currently on the map, because the pattern itself lays the groundwork for how the rest of the season is likely to behave once tropical activity does eventually pick up. So, what should people actually be watching for as this transition continues to play out over the coming days and weeks? And how should that shape any decisions being made around outdoor plans, travel, or simply deciding whether to finally give the air conditioner a rest? The most useful thing to understand is that a pattern break like this one rarely completes in a single clean motion. It tends to unfold in stages, an initial cold front passage bringing the first noticeable change, followed by a period of adjustment as the broader atmosphere settles into whatever new configuration is replacing the old ridge, sometimes followed by additional reinforcing fronts that either strengthen the new pattern or, in some cases, allow a version of the old heat to briefly rebuild before a more decisive, longer-lasting change finally takes hold. That's exactly why the specific duration of this cool down, whether it turns into the longest August stretch below 90 degrees since 2017 in the eastern half of the country, or whether Texas's heat rebuilds again once this initial crack passes, remains genuinely uncertain more than a week or so out, even with the strong ensemble agreement currently pointing toward a real meaningful shift getting underway right now. The most reliable way to track how this actually plays out in your own specific location is to keep watching the shorter range forecasts as each day approaches, rather than assuming any single week-old outlook will hold perfectly, precisely because ensemble forecasting is a tool for identifying the most likely overall trend, not a tool for pinning down the exact temperature on any single specific day 2 weeks in the future. What ties this entire story together, from the cleaner air finally sweeping into Montana, to the monsoon storms returning to a parched Colorado Front Range, to the modest crack finally appearing in Texas's brutal ridge, to the extended cooldown potentially setting records across parts of the East Coast, is that none of these are isolated local weather stories happening to occur within the same general week by coincidence. They're all downstream consequences of the exact same continent-spanning atmospheric reorganization. A stubborn summer ridge that held its ground for weeks finally losing its grip and allowing the broader jet stream to reshuffle into something genuinely different. That's precisely why this particular stretch has caught the attention of meteorologists across so many completely different regions, independently of one another, not because any single day's forecast within it is especially dramatic on its own, but because the underlying pattern driving all of these individual regional stories represents a genuine turning point after weeks of an unusually stubborn, difficult to dislodge summer setup, one that's now finally giving way to something considerably more dynamic and, for a lot of the country, considerably more comfortable, at least for the time being, even as it quietly introduces its own new set of trade-offs, from expanding dryness in some areas to the ever-present question of whether the old heat manages to fight its way back before autumn genuinely arrives. There's a broader, more universal lesson buried inside this entire transition too, one that extends well beyond this particular week's forecast. People often treat a long-range weather outlook as a fixed, unchanging prediction, something either right or wrong once the day in question actually arrives. What this pattern break actually demonstrates is that a long-range outlook is really more like a snapshot of the atmosphere's most likely trajectory at a given moment, one that gets refined and sometimes meaningfully revised as new data comes in and the actual weather gets closer. The version of this August that forecasters were describing 3 weeks ago, dominated by a stubborn, seemingly immovable ridge, looks genuinely different from the version unfolding right now, not because the earlier forecasts were wrong, but because the atmosphere itself evolved exactly the way ensemble forecasting is designed to eventually catch and communicate as it happens. That's a useful thing to keep in mind anytime a seasonal or monthly outlook feels locked in, because more often than not, the reality that eventually plays out ends up looking at least somewhat different from the earliest projections, refined step by step as each new batch of model runs comes in closer to the actual date in question. What do you think? Has the pattern where you live already started to shift, or are you still stuck waiting for this cool down to actually arrive? Let me know in the comments what conditions have genuinely looked like this week, wherever you're watching from, because I'd love to hear whether this transition is hitting your specific area as dramatically as the broader forecast is suggesting, or whether you're in one of the spots still waiting on the old pattern to finally break, still stuck under the same stubborn heat that's defined so much of this summer already. Make sure you're subscribed, because this transition is still actively unfolding, and there's a real chance it either sticks around for weeks or gets challenged by the old heat trying to rebuild, and we'll be tracking exactly which way it goes. Thanks so much for watching this breakdown, and we'll see you in the next one.